Going to be a lot of changes next year, and some of those changes are going to revolve around players that are going to get moved, how they're evaluating the superstars and the all-stars that they believe can take them to win a championship. And an example that I was thinking about is Kevin Durant and everything that they did up there and with the Nets, and they got beat up by injuries. Of course, that's not their fault, but when you're having the debate about who's the best, what's the measuring stick for a leader, and who's going to get you over the hump as you run into a bunch of obstacles throughout the season, these are the types of things that I think come into the discussion. When you lose pieces, when you have adversity within the team, can you still push through? Sometimes they're insurmountable, and I think that's what happened with the Nets. But nonetheless, when you think about the criticism that LeBron has gotten when he was in Cleveland, when he was in Miami, or even the first time when he was in Cleveland and they didn't get the job done, he received a lot of criticism, and he was still able to win a championship after losing a lot of pieces and putting the team on his back and still winning. Very similar to the scenario that I think Kevin Durant just went through, but they didn't get it done. I think there are nuances that occur throughout that, but the optics, and I'm thinking solely from those in the front office, when they're looking at their players, they're thinking about that. This person is super talented, they have skills, so forth and so on, but can they take us to the promised land? And someone else that I think is truly a superstar, but may not have the leadership qualities, is Kawhi Leonard or Paul George. And if they don't get it done this year, I think this is yet another season where they've fallen short of their goals, despite bringing in exceptional talent. And on the flip side, yeah, I absolutely would say that Kawhi Leonard, Kevin Durant are definitely more talented than Chris Paul. But on the leadership side, I think what he brings to the table to bring those guys together, I don't think anybody has been able to do in the NBA at the level that he has. He showed that when he was in Oklahoma City, and they had what he called the band of misfits, and they were able to pull through. But now these teams are going to be thinking about how do they actually pull these teams together. What I wanted to also break down, just some interesting news around LeBron and his jersey. So if everyone knows, if you don't know, he's changing his jersey. And so it made me wonder, is it just a number, or is it just a really big number? And that big number is the financial impact of that. And I think it comes down to dollars and cents. And let me break down why this is the case. Of the top 3 NBA player jerseys sold in the history of the NBA of all time, they have all changed their numbers while being with the same team. Now, that could be a coincidence, but it could also mean that there's something to the fact of changing your number once you get to a certain level or a certain status of merchandise sales. And in this case, we're talking about jerseys, but it applies to pretty much every other industry. When you are an icon in your field of industry, or in your field of your industry, and you have something that you can monetize, and how can you drive an influx of new dollars into that space? And jersey is one of those things. And Michael Jordan, 23, and he changed to 45. Kobe Bryant, he had number 8, and he changed to number 8. And then LeBron, he's changing to number 6. So each of those scenarios, they saw a bump or an increase in those sales. And in fact, it helps you be able to get repeat customers. It's very hard to do when you have one product sold one time to the same customer. They don't have a reason to buy again. However, what if you change your number? What happens? And you're still at the top of your game. I think that's some of the dynamics that are occurring there. And so I think it's very interesting that that's occurred. So LeBron was going to change his number last year, and that didn't occur. And you want to guess why that was? Nike had already produced tens of millions of dollars worth of jerseys of 23, and they would be out of those sales. Now, of course, they'll sell some of those jerseys for nostalgia, for some diehard fans, but the majority of those jerseys couldn't be sold, and they wouldn't be sold. So I think that's what stopped him from changing his number last year. But now, this next year, I think you're going to see him spike again because he's going to change to a new number, and especially if the team does well. And I think that's the caveat. I think the Lakers being competitive again, making it beyond the first round of the playoffs is going to play a big part of that as well. Now, of course, like with every other team in the NBA, injury has played a role. And this has been the optics are that it's been an injury riddled season. However, there's actually some debate about whether or not that's the case. The NBA has come out with a statement in opposition to LeBron, because LeBron went out on Twitter, Instagram, etc., made the statement about how he wasn't behind this season. There was going to be a lot of injuries, so forth and so on, which there were. The NBA states that the injuries this year are on par with any other season. However, what they didn't stipulate was the parameters of the season that they were measuring. If they're measuring it to a full season, probably makes sense. And by a full season, I don't mean just the number of games, but the months in which that season is played, because typically these guys are getting started in October, November, playing all the way through June. This year, they got started in December and going all the way through late June, if you make it all the way to the finals. A lot of the teams just made it up to the end of May. So on average, are those injuries the same as a full season, or were they comparing it to a truncated season of let's say 2019 or 2018, et cetera? And I would bet that they're measuring a full season, in which this is more injuries condensed into a shortened season. However, the bigger impact is the superstars. There are definitely more players, more stars that are facing injuries this year. And of the superstars, of the all-stars, they have missed about 370 games out of a potential 1,900. And that's a 5% increase from previous years. And this is reported by ESPN looking at that data. So whether or not it's the same or it's different, I think what we've definitely seen are our favorite teams, our favorite players being injured. And it hasn't helped being in a shortened season for those players that have regular injuries that we see are injured year over year over year. Example, Anthony Davis, Kawhi Leonard, Chris Paul. These are all players that have experienced injuries time and time again. So I can't honestly say it's a unique season, but it didn't help the fact that they couldn't prepare. They weren't able to get ready and spend time with their teams, with their trainers, so forth and so on. So that's a big impact to what we're seeing for a lot of these players going into next season. Other big news, or other interesting news, I should say, is let me ask, what's the official ball of the NBA? Who makes it? I might say Spalding, and you would be partly correct. The reason I say that is because Spalding has just ended their contract, or they didn't end, it's come to an end with the NBA as official ball of the NBA in favor of Wilson. The reason I'm just bringing this up because I think about the sponsors and the partners of the NBA and how much money they stand to make, and how they're driving merchandise across its sport. And branding is a big deal. And in this case, Wilson has now signed a new contract. They are now selected to be the new ball starting in the 2021-2022 season. Wilson was the ball of the NBA for the first 37 years of the NBA. 1983, Spalding was able to gain that contract and became the primary brand for the basketball of the NBA. And in 2004, they signed an 8-year extension, and that extension was for $125 million, the extension alone. And that made Spalding the ball of choice for that 37-year period. So the first 37, Wilson, next 37, Spalding, and now Wilson is taking over. And Wilson is taking a much different approach than I think a lot of other brands are doing. I think I see it with Nike. Nike definitely consults and thinks about its players and the creation and development of its products. But there's a lot of other apparel manufacturers that necessarily don't do that. So Wilson stood up basically a study with a number of players in the NBA. And in fact, they've created what's called the Wilson NBA Advisory Staff, which is a group of players in the NBA that are advising on latest developments in equipment recommendations, so forth and so on. In fact, they're leading some of the new ideas and ways to think about apparel and equipment, etc. And Wilson is one of those things being involved. So you want to guess who some of those players are on this committee? Trae Young, Jamal Murray are two that lead the top of that list, who are becoming pivotal players for the NBA in terms of being an icon that represents the game. So it's very interesting to me to see how these are just different components of the game that are providing a way for players to be impactful, and is also driving what you see in apparel. And I think you're starting to see a shift in apparel as well, because Spalding has been the ball of choice, the official ball of the game. So now that it's Wilson, you definitely will see a lot of other pull-through of other apparel in brick and mortar stores or online stores, etc. So fans are definitely going to start seeing a shift in that. Very similar to the era when you might have worn members only or starter, and you've seen a shift today to Nike. And many people today can't even remember what starter or members only is. And this is a significant shift in that apparel that I think will happen as well. And not the NBA draft, but the NBA draft lottery occurred this week, in which you have the bottom 14 teams vying for the top pick in the NBA. And the NBA changed this model a couple of 2017, 2018, changed how this works. And for what I believe is the fight against tanking. And again, we saw that with the 76ers and the process, in which I think we all can admit the process is pretty much over. But teams were fighting for the bottom spot in the rankings in order to get the number one pick. And that means fans were paying for tickets to come to games and see their favorite players sit on the bench. They saw coaches and executives sit their best players, not try to be competitive, all the while the tickets are staying at high prices. So the NBA wanted to fight against that. So this new model is a lottery in which the bottom 14 teams will be given a percentage based on their ranking and their opportunity to win. And so how this works, and again, it sounds like physics. 14 balls are placed into a machine, and each team of the 14 teams, starting, let's say, the lowest ranked team, the bottom three are equally weighted, meaning they have a 14% chance of getting the number one pick. And I'll explain what that 14% means. The next two slots will have about 11.5%. Then it'll go down a little bit more to 10.5%, 9%, 7.5%, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0.5% at the 14th position. So what this means is each team is given a 4-digit combination, and the bottom three teams, because they have a 14% chance, they get 140 combinations. The team with the 11.5%, which is slot number 4, they will get 125 combinations. That number goes down significantly from 105 combinations down to 5. So you can imagine they have this sheet with all of these numbers on it. So they pick a ball out of this number 4 times, and you'll end up with that combination. If you have that combination in your list, you get the number one pick. They then repeat that for the number 2 pick, the number 3 pick, so forth and so on. So that's what we just saw experienced in this year's draft. So if you're watching and wondering why your favorite team may or may not have had a chance to get the number 1 pick, it's all based on these combinations and the percentage of available combinations that a given team has. So one of the examples are a team that was impacted by this is Chicago. And Chicago was hoping to get a high pick, and they were in the mix, but they did a deal back in February, in middle of the season, for Nikola Vucevic with the Orlando Magic. And part of that deal said, hey, when they trade Vucevic, Orlando will get Chicago's first round pick, unless Chicago would land in the top 4 picks. Well, this year, based on those combinations and how the lottery played out, Chicago ended up with the number 8 pick, which means that pick automatically goes to Orlando. So this bet that they made back in February or March for hopefully getting the top pick goes up in flames because they don't have a first round pick at all. And they didn't make the playoffs. Part of that trade was in order to make the playoffs, which they weren't able to do. So that was an example of a team making a bet earlier in the season. How did that pan out? And I would argue that it didn't pan out in their favor because they're not able to start a rebuild process with a high pick. And everybody's vying for Cade Cunningham out of Oklahoma State. I think he's a for sure number one. And in fact, he believes he's a for sure number one, so much so that he's not even training with other players on his, or training for other teams that are in that lineup. But you have some other top players in the league that are in the draft. Jalen Suggs is another. Evan Mobley is another out of USC. So there's a few others, and there'll be some hidden gems in there. So I think this year's draft is definitely going to be a bit thinner in terms of perceived value. But nonetheless, we're going to be breaking down in next week and further weeks what that looks like and how teams are making their bets.